Good evening, everyone. Sorry, we're a little bit late. Welcome to another session of Abralim ao Vivo Linguists Online. I'm Thais Oliveira from Federal University of Mato Grosso do Sul. Today, we have the honor and the pleasure to listen to Professor Elizabeth Traugott from Stanford University. As you know, Abralim ao Vivo Linguists Online is an initiative of Abralim, the Brazilian Linguistic Association, in collaboration with linguistic associations worldwide, such as the International Committee of Linguists, the Latin American Association of Linguistics and Philology, ALFAO, the Spanish Linguistic Society, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, the Australian Linguistic Society, the British Association for Applied Linguistics, to mention only a few. First, on behalf of Abralim's board, I would like to thank Elizabeth, who kindly accepted to collaborate with us today. I also want to thank Miguel Oliveira and Raquel Freitag for this event and for Abralim's political engagement in standing up for science. Also, I would like to thank everyone all around for watching us and for waiting to get this transmission. Elizabeth Traugott is one of the very few linguists that really needs no introduction. Professor Emerita of Linguistics and English at Stanford University, she has worked with a great variety of themes, such as historical syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Her work on grammaticalization in collaboration with Paul Hopper and on lexicalization in collaboration with Laurel Brinton is one of the most influential surveys on historical linguistics and has shaped our view of how new items come into being, remaining as a pervasive model to account for linguistic change until today. Recently, in collaboration with Graham Trousdale, they developed a model that incorporates several aspects of grammaticalization and lexicalization within a unified theory of how new pairings of form and meaning arise. Today, she will talk about the development of metatextual discourse markers from a diachronic construction grammar. Well, Elizabeth, I must say, it is my honor and a great pleasure to introduce you. Thank you again, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Can you see me? No.
Yes.
You can? Okay, good. Well, I thank you all of Abralim, everybody, for inviting me to give this talk. I'm very honored to give it. You have been amazing in the work that you've done to expand the community of linguists during this difficult time we're in, because you have chosen a wide range of topics and you've kept us informed, you've kept us engaged. Huge thanks from myself and I'm sure everybody else for this. It's very much appreciated. I'm going to try and get my PowerPoint up now. And can you see that? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, let's go to the Zoom window first.
Yes. Share screen.
And
You got that?
Screen share. Share screen.
I got the.
Great. Now it's working. Good. So let's. Can you use the down arrow? Up and down. Yeah, it's working. Great. Good.
Okay. Well, forgive me, please, everybody, for being. This is the first time I've worked with Zoom, so it's been a little bit complicated. Anyway, what I want to talk about is the rise of topic markers, discourse markers, specifically the metatextual discourse marker, by the way. My goals are to argue that far more attention should be paid to discourse markers than is common in standard, at least US and UK grammars, and especially in cognitive linguistics, and I'd like to exemplify the importance of context in the development of discourse markers. My approach is a constructionist perspective on change and is consistent with the work I did with Graham Trousdale, who is here, picture, in the book that was just mentioned on constructionalization and constructional changes. I want to start with some terminology. The terminology of discourse markers is fraught with problems. There are just too many terms around. In 1987, Deborah Schiffrin wrote a book called Discourse Markers, and she refers to a very wide range of discourse markers in that book. Social markers like well, epistemic markers like I think, I guess, and connectives like and, but, and because. Starting in 1988, Bruce Fraser, but most especially from 1996 on, has used the term pragmatic markers for the large set and reserves the term discourse marker for connectives, including topic shifters like anyway and by the way. And I normally use the word pragmatic markers as the umbrella term and discourse marker in the restrictive sense. But as my topic is DMs, I'm going to use this term for both the umbrella large range of markers as well as the restricted sense. Of course, there are other terms as well, like discourse particles or pragmatic particles. But I am going to mean I am going to mean connectives, social markers, and epistemic markers. My roadmap is I'm going to talk about the main characteristics of discourse markers. Why should cognitive linguists pay attention to discourse markers? Some basics, very basic, of construction grammar, some basics of a constructional approach to change, my case study, by the way, some discussion. And of course, there are alternative ways of thinking about discourse markers. I want to mention one that has become quite popular, the idea that in theoretical grammar, discourse markers are co-opted instantaneously. This has been proposed by Kaltenberg, Heine, and Kudova, starting in 2011, and then I will conclude. So the main characteristics of discourse markers and pragmatic markers in general, they are crucial aspects of communication, whether conversation or monologic talk or writing. They are not restricted to conversation, though some people seem to think so. One writes for someone after all, and so one uses discourse markers. Typically, they are not integrated with the host clause. They're not part of core syntax. They are not truth-conditional, and that has led to some people saying they are meaningless fillers. I have more than once been asked why I am working on expressions that they want to edit out, but they mean a lot. I'd like to start with an example from Mark Davis's new coronavirus corpus. I don't know whether he talked about it. He might have in discussion. It's a new corpus which he started in March of this year. In example 1, local police said a woman who was arrested on charges of driving under the influence purposely coughed on an officer and said, "Oh, by the way, I have the coronavirus and so do you now." Now that "oh, by the way," which was edited out in the Times version of this, New York Times version of this, but is duplicated over and over and over again in several media presentations of this example and how I first met it. This "oh, by the way" signals that a threat is coming up. Consider, you know, or well, or so instead. It is a quite aggressive marker. Now, discourse markers are multifunctional. They are all subjective. Some of them are intersubjective. They're often mobile, that is, they can be used in various places in the clause. They're often set off by a prosodic envelope or a comma in writing. They are, as I said, non-truth conditional, but they are characterized by conventionalized pragmatics. And my Brit Louise Hansen, on the left here, has written a lot about that, particularly in 2012 and later. And recently, Rita Finkbeiner, on the right, has discussed this issue in the journal called Constructions and Frames. So discourse markers are part of grammar, as Fraser said a long time ago. Since I'm working in a construction grammar framework, I was interested to see what cognitive linguists in general and Adele Goldberg as construction grammarian had to say about discourse markers. I find they're not discussed. Langacker here on the left in 1987 has nothing about them. Charles Fillmore and colleagues in Frame Semantics, 1988, has nothing about them. You might say, well, that's a long time ago, and maybe Schiffrin's book hadn't influenced them yet. But the offshoot construction grammar developed by Adele Goldberg in 1995, 2006, 2019, that is not the case. She does not mention them. I find this odd considering that Eve Switzer, in her famous book from Pragmatics from Epistemic Markers, is talking about multifunctionality in the connectives of and, but, or, and so. All of them are Schiffrin's discourse markers. Switzer's book has been tremendously influential. Her hypothesis is that many expressions are understood in three domains: the socio-physical world, that's the real world, the epistemic world of reasoning and belief, and the speech act textual or discourse world. One of her examples is so. He heard me calling, so he came. That's cause in the real world. It's actually truth conditional. You say he's deaf, but he came, so he heard me calling. These are her glosses. Knowledge of his arrival caused the conclusion that he heard me. So I concluded that he heard me, is what that so means. Here we are in Paris. So what would you like to do? Our being in Paris enables my act of asking in the discourse world what you would like to do. Switzer's work has been so important for metaphor studies that we have perhaps lost sight of her statement regarding interpretations in the three domains. Choice of a correct interpretation depends not on form, but on a pragmatically motivated choice between viewing the conjoined clauses as representing content units, logical entities, or speech acts. The key point here is pragmatically motivated choice. This observation could have been the basis of cognitive work on DMs. Now, you might be wondering because and, but, or, so do, of course, appear in grammars, but normally as coordinators and connectives, not as pragmatic expressions. The pragmatics of connectives is discussed at length in relevance theory, such as Blake-Moore, 1987, but less frequent discourse markers like topic-oriented markers, like after all the same, by the way, get almost no attention from cognitive linguists or relevance theorists. Both Langacker and Goldberg present their cognitive theories as usage-based. Usage-based is variously defined by different people, but Goldberg and many others cite Kemmer and Barlow's 99 criteria. One of the criteria is knowledge of language is grounded in instances of speakers producing and understanding language. The point is utterances, not UG or some innate system. Utterances are the basis of knowledge of language. As Goldberg 2013 said, semantics, information structure, and pragmatics are interrelated. All play a role in linguistic function. DMs in the narrow sense are contextualizing cues and processing instructions about how to interpret relationships between clauses. Specifically, these mark the way in which an upcoming discourse topic, I'll call it D2, segment 2, but D2 seems to be more precise about the discourse is coming up. Discourse topic is coming up, to be understood in relation to what preceded, which is D1. The template is D1, DM, D2. So DMs play a key role in the linguistic functions of discourse management and information structuring. Some are used primarily for the topic shifting function, and those are the ones I've been particularly interested in. They signal whether D2 is meant as a digression from the discourse topic D1, like by the way, a justification for content of D1, like after all, continuation of the discourse topic, like also, return to the discourse topic, like anyway, an invitation to reevaluate inferences from D1, like but, and to illustrate invitation to reevaluate inferences, consider, I liked the restaurant, but the food was terrible. I liked the restaurant, all the same, the food was terrible. I liked the restaurant prompts the inference, the food or the service was good. But, and all the same, signal that D2 will reevaluate the inference from D1, I liked the restaurant. So it undoes the inference, food and service were good. Compare that to, I liked the restaurant and the food was terrific. I liked the restaurant, after all, the food was terrific. The prompt, that D2 supports the inference from D1. It's a basic tenet of cognitive linguistics that meaning is not fixed. Rather, there is meaning potential. There is an essentially unlimited number of ways in which an expression can prompt dynamic cognitive processes, as Foucault said back in 2008. This is because expressions are used in context, both linguistic and communicative, and context grounds interpretation. This is particularly true in the case of discourse markers, as Fraser showed, and I will show. Very briefly, one of the main points about construction grammar that are important for understanding what I'm trying to do. According to construction grammar of the Goldberg type, our knowledge of language is organized as a set of network constructions or form-meaning pairings. Recently, somebody said to me that a construction is holistic and indivisible whole, like Saussure's sign, and so that person was not able to understand what I was talking about. So I thought I'd just bring this point up. Acquisition and change so show that it cannot be possible that a construction is holistic and indivisible. A construction must be differentially accessible and composed of parts, as these can be separately interpreted by language learners, as in Croft's well-known 2001 model of constructions, which I will show to remind you in a moment. A child who learns dog and applies it to an animal with 4 legs has learned a component, a part of the meaning of dog, not the holistic construction. And any component of a construction is open to change. Here is Bill Croft, and I will show his model. In his model, there are 3 form properties linked to 3 meaning properties. The 3 form properties are syntactic, morphological, phonological, and the 3 meaning properties are semantic, pragmatic, and discourse functional. These properties are not discrete, they have overlap, and each is subject to change. You may well be familiar with this. The idea of the construction is this. This is the unified whole. 3 kinds of form linked to 3 kinds of meaning. And it's really important that the meaning is conventional. Semantics is always thought to be conventional. Pragmatics is sometimes not thought to be conventional, but we're dealing here with conventional meanings associated with particular expressions, and discourse functional properties are also conventional. And by conventional, I mean shared by some community of speakers. I am working as a cognitive linguist and someone who adopts a usage-based model. So I assume something absolutely consistent with what Croft said a decade ago. Change inevitably occurs because speakers acquire knowledge of language throughout life. I think Gillian Sankoff talked about that a few days ago. Speakers actively use language. They negotiate meaning. Even as children, they are speakers who are not passive brain boxes with parameters set by input, as Lightfoot once suggested. What someone says or writes is not necessarily understood in the way it was meant, so perception and production are asymmetric. Components of a construction may be mismatched in speaker and hearer interaction. I also assume that innovations lead to change, but they are not changes. This is very debatable. But I would agree with Croft and Bybee that innovations must be replicated and conventionalized for change to occur. Usage changes, and that is in contrast to what Kiparsky said back in 1968, that grammars change. That's the generative position. But I'm taking the position that usage changes. And now getting to, by the way, my data. Data are largely from early English books online, 755 million words of early modern English from 1475 to 1700. Books published during that period. That's important because the dates that are given are dates of the book publications, not of the actual production of the work. Also used the corpus of late modern English texts, which is 34 million words, mostly literary. Koha, the corpus of historical American English, put together by Mark Davis, 1810 to 2009, and that's about 400 million words. And COCA, which Mark Davis talked about, corpus of contemporary American English, 1990 to 2019, which grew to 1 billion words as of March of this year. Now, when you look at discourse markers, you will find that they originate historically in discoverable lexical expressions. Brinton has done a lot of work on mainly on the history of social and epistemic markers, like I think, you know, I guess. Some discourse markers originate in adverbial adjuncts. By the way, originates in along the road, but in on the outside. After all, in after everything, and so from in that manner. And now is clearly temporal in origin. There are also clauses, and Brinton has been particularly interested in clauses, such as albeit, I guess, I mean. Many of the epistemic markers in English are based in clauses. And the third syntactic source, but not very frequent in English, is noun phrases like all the same, no doubt, and so forth. So here, zeroing in on by the way, I'm going to summarize very briefly what I said in an article that was published in a Journal of Pragmatics earlier this year. In contemporary English, speakers and writers use by the way to signal what's called digression. What it actually is a change in an offhand manner to a new topic in D2 that is represented as less important than D1. That is the usual description of it, though I don't think it's quite accurate. But here is an example from the new billion-word COCA, talking about an online game. All of them have failed by staying way too close to the same formula. By the way, I also consider Zelda 2 as one of my favorites. That is simply an added comment, a footnote in an offhand way. But actually, more frequently, I've done some counting recently, more frequently you find it used as a hedge, introducing a possibly sensitive topic in D2 and appearing to downplay the importance of that topic. The as if, the appearance is very, very important in the development of this particular discourse marker. What do you love about her? That's Lady Gaga. By the way, you're in for a very rude awakening. Her ice blue lipstick, the blood drinking, the feminine voice. By the way, here signals both a digressive topic. It's not a obvious continuation of what you love about her. To go on and say, you're in for a very rude awakening. So it looks like a digression. It's a departure from the topic. And it's a kind of hedge, which is typical of multifunctionality. And it's a hedge on something that might be considered a little bit sensitive. And it's been used increasingly in this way since the 1930s, and increasingly used as a marker of aggression. And that first example I gave, oh, by the way, I have the coronavirus as a very recent kind of use of it. By the way, it originates in an adverbial phrase we would now express as on or along the way. And what I'll call stage 1, which is exemplified from about the year 1000 to 1900, is found as a locative and directional adverbial. Though they not faint by way. We didn't have to have an article in Old English. And by the way, his wife, Creusa, he les. Along the way, his wife, Creusa, he lost. That's from Chaucer. The road is a background for the event. The painting is more important than the road. And clearly, he lost his wife, Creusa, is much more important than the road on which they were traveling. By the end of the 15th century, you start to find, by the way, the road being used as background context for talk. It was told him, by the way, that his wife was dead. Not bare, he lost his wife on the way. It was told him, by the way, that his wife was dead. Why then? We are awake. Let's follow him. By the way, let us recount our dreams. By the way, on our path as we travel. The kind of context is replicated with a number of different locutionary verbs, like tell, observe, which means mention at that time almost exclusively, not see, recount, and say. Now, I haven't given you statistics here, but there are a large number of examples of this. Starting in the end of the 15th century, and in the 16th century, we had another context where the route is a metaphor for argumentation. This reminds me of Lakoff and Johnson's metaphor, argument is a journey, Reddy's conduit metaphor, and the roadmap that I used at the beginning to outline what I was going to talk about. The argumentation journey is almost always introduced in the text of this time by say, mention, or some other locutionary verb. Many other details which I omit at this time. He's talking about geography. I will say this much in passing, or by the way, that this strait passes over the coast of Africa to the Tropic of Cancer. So I'm adding this as a footnote in passing. And so for about 100 years during the 16th century, we find, by the way, used as background in two registers, ordinary talk and philosophical or other argumentation. In both cases, it is used as a background to locutionary acts. Langacker in 2010 already drew attention to the importance of verbs of speaking, or verba dicendi, in the rise of connectors like however. So this is a very common context for the rise of discourse markers, at least those in the restrictive sense of connectors. Back to by the way. By the time we get to the mid-17th century, there are some examples that, with hindsight, as modern readers, we could take to be ambiguous. Which city is now dwindled to nothing? Reader, by the way, I observe that cities surnamed the Great come to little at last. Here, I think you can legitimately interpret, by the way, as either in passing, the metaphorical use, reader, in passing, I observe that cities are surnamed the Great, or the inferred use, marking a new discourse topic. It's a topic shift from a particular city to cities in general. And it's marking that D2 is only partially relevant, therefore, to D1 because it's shifting from the particular to the general. And around the same time, around the 1650s, we find unambiguous examples that look perfectly modern. My hypothesis is that what happened over the 2 centuries, from the end of the 15th century, so the late 1400s, to the 1650s, is that literal travel and non-literal argumentation journey were repeatedly referred to as non-essential contexts for talk and argumentation. Talk and argumentation became associated with and conventionalized as part of the function of by the way. By the way came to be used as a comment on the nature of D2, in this case, a non-essential digression or background. This kind of shift in perspective from the path being a background to the discourse being a background is the kind of phenomenon known as context absorption in the grammaticalization literature. Tanya Kuteba talked about it back in 2001. Now, I've attempted a very sketchy partial model of changes to by the way, simply to show how Croft's model can be used. And I think it can be used quite usefully in trying to think about what changes have occurred. It's simply descriptive of what we find in our text. So using the idea of the construction with 3 form components and 3 meaning components, what's key here is that a locative adverb, syntactic component, has given rise to a discourse marker. And I happen to have talked only about pre-clausal ones. There are medial ones, not very many, and there are final ones. But let's just say it's a discourse marker that can occur in various places. The phonological changes are just general changes in the language, but the semantics is important, where the original locative adverb referred to a route, a path. There's no such notion at stage 2, so it's blank. The pragmatic inferences and conveying of, by the way, it does is digressive topic change and hedge, and its discourse function is metatextual. So what has happened is that there's been a pretty radical change in this part of the constructional configuration. And none of that would have happened, I propose, without its occurring in replicated contexts, such as I've talked about between the years 1450 and 1700, of talk and textual journey. So inadequate though this little model is, at least it can give us some overall way of thinking about the changes within a construction, that the components of a construction change. Over time, association of the discourse marker, by the way, with partial relevance and casualness, I believe, enabled the interpretation as an index of the hedging function as well as topic shift. And D2 is presented as if it is not important. One of my favorite examples is this one. All the same pastor, I respect you more than I did before. By the way, did I hear or did I not that our late lamented Uncle Peter, though unmarried, was a father? By the way, introduces, along with this prevarication, did I hear or did I not, doubly hedged, pretty shocking question in the year 1897. And you find lots of examples like this in the corpora around this time. So how do we get from hedging use to the in-your-face uses in the coronavirus corpus? There's many examples in the corpora of association over the 20th century of, oh, by the way, and particularly, oh, by the way, but also by the way, with people in authority who introduce important negative content as if it is unimportant. Everything a person says is suspect in my eyes from there on. It's that old, oh, by the way, routine. There's a wonderful example, much too long to quote, with a CEO who is alleged to have given 3 indications of restrictions for his workers and his team, all of them introduced by, oh, by the way. Association with negative content enabled use as a marker of negative attitude to D2, and in the coronavirus case, to the addressee. The histories of many discourse markers in English are similar. I mentioned that but used to mean on the outside of, after all means after everything, also exactly so. The first stage is akin to Sweeter's socio-physical objective use, and the later DM use to her speech act use. All DMs exemplify subjectification of meanings over time. Used as a circumstantial locative adverb, by the way, is objective and truth-conditional. Used as a DM, it signals speaker writer's perspective on the relationship between D1 and D2. As I've said, it may be an adoptive perspective. In many places, downplaying the importance of D2 is an as if posture. Some DMs, such as by the way, exemplify intersubjectification of meaning over time as well. By intersubjectification, I mean paying attention to addressee or reader in a way that has not been demonstrated before. For example, use as a hedge. It doesn't start out as a hedge. It comes to be used as a hedge in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly the 19th and 20th. You get aggressive uses. So, by the way, it did not arise as a direct mapping from the real world to the discourse world. It did not arise as a metaphor. It did not rise instantaneously. It took 250 years, according to EEBO and Koha. Which brings me to the alternative perspective on how discourse markers arise. Goldberg, Heine, Kuteva, and Long in various combinations, starting with Goldberg et al., which is Goldberg, Heine, and Kuteva in 2011, have developed an alternative account of the rise of discourse markers. It is typologically oriented, and it includes Japanese and Chinese examples and is a very rich source of data. They argue for a 2-level discourse grammar consisting of sentence grammar, which is fairly traditional syntax, and thetical grammar, a level where so-called asyntactic material, such as parentheticals, imperatives, and discourse markers are accounted for. These are some of what Huddleston and Pulham call supplements. My key concern is that Goldberg et al. Hypothesized that expressions in thetical grammar are co-opted instantaneously. I think that many of those that are conventionalized, such as use of relativizers, are not co-opted instantaneously. However, I'm talking about discourse markers. It is not true of discourse markers. I have found only one for which I do not have data showing gradual change over centuries. And I've looked at a lot of discourse markers, probably a couple of dozen. There is one, all the same, which means, however, it has a 2-decade time frame, 1800 to 1820. That is relatively instantaneous. And I think it can be accounted for by analogy to pre-existing. After all, you don't need a dual level grammar to account for that. Construction grammar is a single level grammar that does the job quite well of accounting for expressions that do not conform to standard syntax. In fact, it was originally developed precisely for that purpose, to account for idiosyncratic expressions. I'm thinking here of Kay and Fillmore's paper on What's That Fly Doing in My Soup. So coming to a conclusion, metatextual discourse markers of the type I have outlined are used to express speaker, writer's cognitive intentions and perceptions regarding text management. They are used in negotiation of meaning in communicative discourse. We can't do without them, whether in conversation, fictional representation of speech, or in academic prose. I remember when I was reading stories to my daughter a long time ago, when people thought that children didn't understand even things like and but, it was almost impossible to read to her some of the children's stories because I just had to add in various kinds of discourse markers to make any coherent sense out of them. They are part of our knowledge of grammar. Therefore, they should be included in standard grammars and deserve attention by linguists of all persuasions. They are very much part of the linear structure of language. Haselow 2010 and others have suggested that they serve to signal what's coming next, whether in term-taking or in monolongal discourse. Individual discourse markers have constraints on where in the clause they may be used and what they may mean there. By the way, can be used initially, strictly speaking, pre-clausally, medially, and finally, strictly speaking, post-clausally. They do not mean the same thing in those places. Post-clausally, by the way, is very definitely simply a digression, something added on in a way that suggests that what was just said was not very important, or not to be taken as very important. It is not a hedge there. Well can be used only initially and medially, but used to be used only initially. It's recently been found, finally, with concessive meaning, particularly in Australian English, as discussed by Mulder and Thompson in 2008 and elsewhere. There are constraints in the combinations of discourse markers and how you can put them together. So they challenge, in my way of thinking, Chomsky's negative view of communication and linearity in the first lecture. A construction approach to grammar focuses on schemas, patterns, and sets. So in addition to thinking about linearity, we need to think about paradigmatic choices. What are the subclasses of DMs that can occur in a DM, D1, DM, D2 construction? How did they develop over time? How are they kept separate and how are they differentiated? How are those functions undergoing modification now? So there's a lot of work still to do. And thank you for your participation, and I hope to have some discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. We have lots of questions and comments and people from all over Brazil and from around the world as well. Okay, let's start with Sebastian from Unesp. He asked, what would you say would be the relevant principles of classical grammaticalization for a constructional approach to change in discourse markers?
I could give you a very long answer. I will try and make it short. Back in 1995, I gave a paper, which is often cited, though it was never published, saying that discourse markers were a kind of grammaticalization, except with one, in respect to one feature, which is scope expansion. Well, at that time, I was kind of beginning to move away from grammaticalization, and I created an enormous fuss, I will say, by saying that we maybe should rethink scope reduction. But after a while, I decided that it was better to think about grammaticalization as a very particular kind of change, the development of grammatical markers. I do actually think that discourse markers are grammatical, but if I could get rid of unidirectionality as a driving point and rethink it, and not just rethink scope expansion, but rethink the whole thing, I could come up with a different way of thinking about it, and that was constructionalization. I don't know whether that quite answers the question, but it's a different way of thinking. I've sometimes said it's like putting on 3D glasses. You, instead of looking at one form, you have to look at the form and the meaning in all these various contexts.
Okay, thank you. Mariangela from Federal Fluminense, she's asking, how are textual connectors, I believe she means connectives, and discourse markers related, and how they would be, what would be their distinctive factors, and can they form specific paradigms in a language?
Well, I have only been talking about connectors in the general sense. I suppose one could use the word connective for and, but, so, or, and connectors for those things that Fraser talks about a lot, which are not exclusively connectives, but also things that connect D1 and D2, which is what I was talking about. Now, by the way, in my view, and I presented it as a connector, I wouldn't say it's a connect if in the syntactic sense, but pragmatically, meaningfully, discourse functionally, it is a connective because its business is to show that there's a topic shift, or it's used to show that there's a topic shift. So there are always terminological problems. And I think some terms have been used, like connect if, are associated with syntax. But now that I'm working in construction grammar, I can't just think about syntax alone. I have to think about syntax and semantics both together. That was what attracted me to construction grammar. And so I'm really talking about connectors in general.
Okay. Well, many discourse markers, they start out as connectives, as adverbial connectives. So,
yeah.
Well,
they end up as adverbial connectives. They start out as adverbial, very literal, very contentful.
Yeah.
Adverbials of space and time. That's what they usually end up as. And they end up as connectors. Yeah.
Yes. Another Thaisa, she's asking, how do you say we can understand the relation between intersubjectification and constructionalization? Is there any kind of straightforward connection?
I would say that it's a very particular subtype of change. If you think about that set of parameters that Croft suggested, I don't think he calls them parameters, he calls them characteristics, properties. The pragmatic properties allow for subjectification and intersubjectification. I would say that intersubjectification is something that happens sometimes, and there's no intrinsic inherent link between the two. The intersubjectification is most closely related to communication and how we understand each other and what we want to do with language.
Vanya Sambrana is asking, in the creation of By the Way, is there an element that lost the total compositionality first? And if it's there, why?
Well, I think it lost its compositionality. I didn't mention that, but it lost its compositionality when it was used as a discourse marker. Or rather, from a usage perspective, I would say speakers lost any sense of its compositionality when they started to use it as a discourse marker. So around 1650. Now, it doesn't mean that one cannot figure out that, by the way, has something to do with a wayside. And of course, you can make puns and you can make all kinds of jokes, because if we're literate, at least, we can recognize by the way, and we can see that it's the same. Now, whether speakers who are not literate and who might use by the way would recognize compositionality, I do not know. But I think for anybody who's literate, they can do all kinds of things, like be going to. I doubt that any normal speaker of English thinks of be going to as originating in being on the way to some place for a purpose. But because they say gonna, you're not going to get that from gonna. Now, by the way, has not, to my knowledge, been reduced phonologically. So it could be made compositional if you want to. And I'm sure some people play around with by the way, anyway, and many other way expressions that we have. So it's feasible to make it compositional, but as a discourse marker, I would say it's non-compositional.
Okay. Flavia from Oscar is asking, what do you think about Denzinger and Vandelanote proposal that discourse markers could also be understood as a marker of perspectivization point of view?
Well, they definitely are. I mean, subjectification is perspective. Vandelanote, yes, and I would say in that, probably thinking about the article on pure, which is not a discourse marker, but a degree marker. There's definitely perspectivization. I've actually worked on discourse markers as stance markers. And I think my examples, the as if property of, by the way, really shows that this is a perspective. This is a, to use Vandelanote in his book on quotation, they're often used as pseudo quotations. That is, if you are representing your CEO as having said something that you don't like, he may very well be attributed. Oh, by the way. So yes, it has everything to do with perspective. It has to do with stance. It has to do with subjectivity. It has to do, I mean, by the way, it's very, very strongly a matter of perspective. And my insistence on as if was really meant to be a shorthand for that. Yes.
Okay. Junior from Unesp is asking, what are the limits between discourse markers and parenthetical constructions?
Well, that is an extremely interesting question that I cannot really answer. By the way, it's an interesting one because it is sort of parenthetical. And in fact, if you look at the corpora, you will find several of them in parentheses. Now, parentheticals are a very large group of expressions. As Kaltenberg, Heine, Gudeval, Long, and others have said, there are different kinds of parentheticals. There are those that you can just produce on the fly, and there's no question that those are co-opted instantaneously. Then there are other ones that are very conventional. I would say that there are conventional parentheticals like, well, I'm having a hard time thinking of one, but anyway, there could be conventional parentheticals, but discourse markers are conventional in the sense that we share knowledge of these things. We know more or less what a by the way means. We know more or less what an after all means. He is, by the way, the president is a very different statement from he's after all the president. And you can imagine, what might have gone before. They are conventional. Now, I'm not sure that all parentheticals are conventional. So to begin to answer this question, which I think would require a huge amount of work, I would look for the conventional parentheticals to see whether one can constrain them in some kind of way to include discourse markers or not.
Okay. Taylor is asking, how can discourse markers be understood in the context of construction grammar? There are families of network for different constructions.
That really has to do with my last slide. We think in terms of individual constructions, which are imagined to be abstracted away from into larger schemas. And these schemas have subschemas. And these schemas, of course, are related to other things we know about language. We don't just know discourse markers, nor do we just know predicate clause construction. I think the question has to do with well, there are two ways of thinking about the question. One is how do you combine a discourse marker with D1 and D2? That has to do with the whole business of how you combine constructions. Goldberg has suggested that a sentence like, I am not tired, or are you not tired, would be a combination of constructions such as You are tired. This is a statement. And a negative. And if you make it into a question, then it's a combination of that with a question as well. So one question that has to do with how one relates discourse markers to other constructions or construction grammar in general is the question of how you combine. And I have gave you the template D1, DM, D2, just as a shorthand for you have to have combinations of various sorts. Now, the other way to answer the question is how does one think about discourse markers in terms of other things in language like the modal schema? There's a lot of overlap because obviously there are many discourse markers in the Schiffrin sense that are epistemic and they are modal. So there's a link to modality. There is a link to all kinds of expressions like concessives. We can do concessives by things other than, after all. We can do them by although, we can do them by whole clauses, we can do them in different ways. So I think the answer to the question is you have to think in two ways. It's about combining and it's about the paradigms. And if you start with meaning, then you can look sort of onomasiologically or paradigmatically at all the ways in which you could express concession, for example.
So you could group together all the different types of constructions in a one family, if you take the meaning perspective.
If you do, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think most people working in the Goldberg model do take meaning as the prime perspective.
Okay.
But that's a problem for a historical linguist or anybody dealing with corpora because you can only look for four. It's a kind of paradox of the research methodology.
There's someone here, I don't know its name. How could you define discourse markers simultaneous multifunctionality in construction grammar?
How do I find all of those together in one? Well, I can't define them all in one.
Yeah, that's a big question.
Discourse markers, I just want to check the question. Discourse markers, multifunctionality, and construction grammar. Okay, well, discourse markers I normally think of as those kinds of metatextual markers that are used to combine discourse topics. They're metatextual. It can be used more broadly, as I said at the beginning, and I deliberately used the term more broadly because it gets awfully confusing when you switch back from discourse marker to pragmatic marker. But in answer to this particular question, I would say discourse markers are cues to how to interpret the relation of D2 to D1. Multifunctionality is something that is not limited to discourse markers. All kinds of things can be multifunctional. If I say I don't like that at all, it could be a joke, it could be a statement, it could be a rejection, it could be all sorts of things. I mean, a whole sentence can be multifunctional, but not usually in a conventional way. The thing about discourse markers is most of them are multifunctional in conventional ways. How do I combine that with construction grammar? Well, they're examples of constructions, but there are multiple millions of other constructions, of course.
There's a very nice question here by Juliano. He's asking how do connectives with different sources, such as but and mas in Portuguese, develop into discourse markers with similar functions in different languages?
I will confess to not having studied them in different languages. But I assume that the processes are the same. We have this thing called the uniformitarian principle, which not everybody likes to agree with. And it is a little bit questionable because we're not entirely sure that people living in a digital age necessarily process things the same way as people who lived in caves several millennia ago. But putting that aside and thinking of the historical record that we have over the last several millennia in some cases and not very long at all in other cases, the assumption is that the regular processes that we bring to interaction are more or less the same. In principle, we try to understand each other, or perhaps deliberately not understand each other in certain circumstances. But basically, humans interact as speakers and as hearers. A speaker says something, the hearer wants to hear something. And in that process, there may be mismatches, there may be miscues. Now, if it just happens once, nothing's going to happen. But it happens several times. And it happens in certain discourses. I used the context deliberately of talk to show how something can appear in corpora and really seem to be very important. So I'm not saying that every discourse marker in every language would necessarily require a context of talk suddenly appearing in the corpora. But there'll be some kind of context which starts being replicated that reasonably could lead to the new interpretation. That's my view of how that works cross-linguistically. But it has to be based in an understanding of processing, production, and perception, and in the asymmetry between the speaker and the hearer.
Okay. Well, that's what Bybee says about language change. It usually goes in a one direction, even though language can be specific, of course, but cognitive process are one and the same for humankind, let's say like that. I have a question of my own. I read a paper of yours on discourse markers, and you were discussing the three kinds of links between constructions: the horizontal links, external links, and vertical links. Well, vertical links and external links are pretty clear to me, but I am a little bit confused on what kind of information we should account for on horizontal links. Could you please talk a little bit about that?
Sure. That goes beyond anything that I wanted to get into in the talk, but so it'll be a little bit technical. Horizontal links are essentially ways of talking about variation. Capel in 2006 talked about allostructions. He was thinking of the fact that you can have variants of a construction that are pretty much determined. His example was we have a plural and a singular tense marker in English, is, but it's totally predictable that the plural will be z after a voice consonant. It will be s after a voiceless consonant, and it will be is after another fricative. That's totally predictable. They are variants of the construction plural or third person singular in English. Now one can extend that, and it has been extended by various people, Perek among them, and myself and Eva Tantner, to various kinds of much more complex constructions like the relationship between give someone something and give something to someone. Those are considered variants. Now, these are not determined in the same kind of way that the allomorphy or morphophonology, if you like, of s, z, and is are. But they are variants that have a certain degree of predictability. So the horizontal relations have to do with predictability. Now, where would that work with, by the way? It would work in terms of meaning differences between preclausal, medial, and postclausal. And I didn't talk about position. And as I just mentioned very, very briefly, they do not mean exactly the same thing there. You might be thinking of my article about after all. And after all is a very clear case of totally different meanings, beginning, middle. So after all means at the beginning, some kind of elaboration. In the middle, it means be sure to remember that after he is, after all, the president example. It's reminding you of something and wanting you to share that. And well, they didn't get married after all. That doesn't mean that at all. It means, although they thought they would be. So I used the horizontal argument for those variations, if that's the article you were thinking about. And I've used it elsewhere. Yeah. The point is that we're looking for variation. How do you account for variation?
Thank you. Maria Carolina from UFSCar is asking, could you say something, if you could you say something about the importance of an interactional approach to account for diachronic analysis of insubordinate monoclausal constructions?
Oh, that's another topic. Insubordinate. Okay. First of all, let me say that I think insubordinate is an unfortunate term. I think it's unfortunate because it relies so much on syntax. It assumes that if I say, if you would close the door, which is an insubordinate, presupposes that something went before. It presupposes a D1. Because mostly, if you use a conditional if, it is preceded by something or followed by something. It's a two-part construction, in other words. In standard grammar, but my grandson, when he goes to school, he one day objected to my saying, well, that's a question and you should answer the whole thing. I've forgotten what the question was. It's irrelevant. But it's, you know, the kind of question a 5-year-old gets that as an exercise. So where is the apple? And you're supposed to answer, the apple is in the bowl. And he had just answered in the bowl. And I said, your teacher won't like that. You'd have to say, it is in the bowl. And he said, well, that's nonsense. At 5 years old, he was objecting to this. Now, I think he was doing exactly what you have to do when you're thinking about insubordinates. There are a whole lot of them, and the if conditional one that is often cited is a standard conventionalized quotes insubordinate, meaning I would be grateful if you would, but if you look at the corpora, there are almost no examples whatsoever of things like I would be grateful if you would. People just have been saying that for a while. Now, they skip. You can always skip a D1 because it can pragmatically evoke it. So I think the question was, how does this fit in construction grammar? Is that the question?
Yeah.
What? Could you remind me?
What's the importance of an interaction approach to that kind of phenomena?
Yeah, well, I think I've been talking about interaction. The thing is, if you produce an insubordinate, you are assuming that your addressee can construct the other clause. You are assuming, in the case of if you can open the door, that the addressee can construct, I would be grateful. But maybe you don't have to even go that far. The interaction is that there's an awful lot, in my view, of interpretation going on, invoking of various kinds of pragmatic relationships. And some of the insubordinates are very standardized and very conventionalized. I particularly took that one because it is so conventionalized. But I think you can pretty much always imagine some context for an insubordinate. You don't have to have the whole construction. And I did write about this, and I went back to Old English, which I do not find any insubordinates, but I do find in the only represented or invented constructed conversation that we have from Old English from around the year 1000, Alfred's colloquium, which is supposed to teach lay monks who come from rural backgrounds how to construct sentences and so forth. And there are lots of questions. One is to the laborer, the person who has cows. And there are questions exactly like my grandson was asked. Where do you feed your cows? And the person answers in the field, or some equivalent of that. In other words, you use an NP to answer a full causal sentence. Now you can reconstruct there the rest of the sentence. But it seems to me that insubordinates are like that. Insubordinates are partial, if you like, partial clauses or clauses that are partial elements of a complex sentence. And they're all of the same sort. Paradigmatically, they all function the same kind of way. They are ways of responding or ways of invoking attention. So that's how I would fit them in.
Okay, thank you. There's a last one. In your background information, you didn't refer. Wow, I don't know what that is. To show rap or Osman. Is your approach different?
Scarab. I didn't refer to Scarab. Yes, that is true. He was one of the first people to talk, of course, about discourse markers. I've forgotten the year, but anyway. He was important, very important in the development of work on discourse markers. I didn't talk about him because I very particularly wanted to pick up on Schiffrin's use of the connective and, but, or, and so, and their connection to Sweets's work and so forth. He talked more about, and non-metatextual markers, which is why I didn't mention him, but you're absolutely right. Of course, he was one of the first, I think, 1981. Very definitely a pioneer in the work on discourse markers.
Well, I guess it's time to wrap it up. Would you like to say some final words?
Oh, well, I have enjoyed the questions. I appreciate it. And again, I want to say how very much I've appreciated the series and your very hard work at Aberlin. It must have been an enormous effort, I think, to put this together, and very exciting. So thank you.
Well, once again, I would like to thank you, Elizabeth, for accepting Aberlin's invitation and for your pointless to say excellent talk. Thank you, Miguel, Raquel, and everyone in Aberlin's board for this brilliant event that keeps us together and makes us stronger. Thank you, everyone, for watching us, for all your questions and comments. Everyone from all around the world are sending you some regards. And please support Aberlin's social media and give a like to this video. In this awful time when nonsense pseudoscience is growing so strong, this is our way to say science will not stop. We will not stop. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone. Stay home, stay safe, and that's it. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.